You are listening to Talking Star Wars. We're going to talk about Star Wars. This is Alex. My name is Connor.
Yeah, this is Alex.
I'm going to talk over Alex. And we're going to talk about Star Wars. So, why Star Wars? Why is Star Wars such why is it such a blight on popular culture? And by blight, I mean bright spot.
I was going to say blight. I mean, some people might consider a blight, but it is also one of the largest multimedia franchises in existence, with staying power far beyond what its humble origins would reveal. And its origins are not all that humble to begin with.
It gets a lot of attention, but it's something that we love dearly because it's inspiring. I don't know what else to sum up Star Wars as.
Yeah, well, let's just summarize a little bit. We're two 30-year-old men sitting here. So we were both born in the early 90s.
Jaded, tired.
Dude, you're 30, get over it.
Bloated.
But, yeah, and the first Star Wars movie came out in, 1977, I believe.
Yeah.
So,
we weren't around.
More than a decade before our births, the first trilogy was already done.
Yes.
And in our formative years, what they call the prequel trilogy now was released. And our entire childhood was saturated with the kind of intensive merchandising and, media saturation that, a trilogy of movies, but then all of its ongoing ancillary materials embedded in popular culture. There might have only been the three movies that ran from the late 70s to the early 80s, but that spawned a fairly effective multimedia empire. I grew up playing, games on my Nintendo 64 and my GameCube that had X-Wings in them.
The crates of toys that were inspired by the movies, and not just the movies, but inspired by the comic books and the books and the video games spawned by the movies. So it's fair to say that it's hard to remember a time in our lives before Star Wars because there was not a time in our lives before Star Wars.
No, yeah, I mean, I probably watched the first of the movies for the first time when I was probably not even quite old enough to understand what was happening, and then continued to watch them throughout my childhood. I certainly had watched all of them multiple times before the release of The Phantom Menace when I was 7 years old.
Was that the first time that you were exposed to Star Wars? Was it someone sat me down and showed me Star Wars, and then here come the toys, here come the games? Or is it something that you had already been around these materials and then it's been supported by seeing the film afterwards?
So I believe I can't really separate a time in my childhood before, I had seen Star Wars. Right when I remember my father picked up the remastered VHSs in a triple from A New Hope to Empire Strikes Back to Return of the Jedi. And watching those VHSs was my first experience watching Star Wars. And I remember also watching them with my grandfather on his Laserdisc machine when I was young as well. So I believe the movie started first, and then as I grew older enough to have, various toys and things, I do remember I had a action figure carrier that was shaped like the Millennium Falcon, and it had a variety of action figures. And then one of the first large Christmas presents I ever got was the AT-AT from the Battle of Hoth, and I got that when I was 8 or 9. I put that together because Lego didn't get the Star Wars license until 1999 in the lead up to The Phantom Menace. It was their first licensed product, and it made them so much money that they now license things like Ghostbusters and other franchises. Before that, Lego was entirely in-house stuff.
I hadn't known about that. I remember Star Wars and Harry Potter. Those were two early licensed lines from Lego.
I believe they were the two original ones, yeah. They each made heaps and heaps of money.
Back when they were all yellow.
Yeah. And, of course, we could get into later about talking about the savviness of George Lucas and retaining the merchandising rights. And
that's more jaded conversation.
Yeah.
It's not as bright and not as hopeful, maybe, as the Star Wars mythos as a whole is.
Yeah, because you could certainly see the intent to sell toys made in some of the media decisions.
Mm-hmm.
But we're going to try to focus less on the more cynical business aspects, though we may have a couple special episodes that talk about where does business influence Star Wars. We're going to look at it as a multimedia setting doesn't even quite cover it. How did I phrase it the other day? It's
a
pan-cultural media,
conglomeration.
Yeah. Everything for there's
Mm-hmm.
11 movies currently, 5 or 6 TV shows,
And counting.
hundreds of novels in 2 different
Mm-hmm.
canons, uh, dozens of video games in 2 different canons. Some that are sort of are outside of either of the canons because they're set differently or so far in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what we want to touch on now is why does Star Wars have this enduring cultural impact across all spheres where even it's like pizza, even when Star Wars
Mm-hmm.
isn't the best, it's still pretty good and people still go and eat lots of it.
I was thinking about why does Star Wars matter to me? Why does Star Wars matter in a wider context? I remember when I was first, my first Star Wars memory is not seeing the movies, but it's seeing a toy commercial. Uh, I don't know if it was Powers of the Force quite then, but it was the first time that uh, I think Hasbro changed the model from the standard kind of like stock build of their action figures to this like
You can't see it, but
action.
Connor is making the
Oh
gestures of
yeah,
the action figure in front of the microphone.
yes, is
Yeah.
the standard gestures of an action figure, as you can imagine, with the lightsaber that came out of Luke's wrist and all that. But they changed them into almost He-Man inspired, like they were in action poses and they were bulky, and no one liked them at first. But I saw this commercial where I was so young. They had Obi-Wan Kenobi's toy shifting into Chewbacca, so I thought there's a toy line with werewolves. And I thought, this is foolish, and I eventually saw, I'm pretty sure, that same VHS box set that it was the first time since Laserdisc that Star Wars was out together, and it was before the gold VHS that added the CGI effects.
That was the one I'm referring to. It was the gold CGI one. Came out in 1998 or 1997.
At least you had the Laserdiscs, though. Those are special. But Star Wars is mythic. It has its own mythical canon where even if you're a young person who hasn't seen the movies, who's watching it and doesn't understand the jargon, the sci-fi jargon, you see these archetypal characters. You see the hero, you see the sidekicks of a different variety, whether that be the like badass scoundrel or the twerpy like metal one, or the old like wise janitor. That's just the all of these archetypal figures that people look up to and aspire to, that is common in things like Greek mythology or in comic books or in just different fictional fields. It instantly created this canon of science fiction, fantasy, mythos crossing multiple genre.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons it was immediately popular, I mean, you can look at the cultural context of the late 70s to see why, but it fairly closely follows the monomyth story from, A Hero with a Thousand Faces, where the hero has a call to action, he has a mentor that dies, he surrounds himself with a cadre of like-minded heroes. The only way in which Luke differs from a standard hero is he doesn't really have a love interest. They fake you out with Leia, but it turns out she's Han's love interest.
And we should talk about that another day as well. Just the strange planning of the Star Wars universe.
Well, Star Wars has certainly advanced in gender roles since
What's
1970,
happening?
as the depictions of Carrie Fisher will and the way she has played her characters has certainly changed. So one, it harkens back to this original monomyth story that you see in things even like the Iliad and the Odyssey, where you recognize all of the parts. But then it puts itself in a setting in a way that the setting takes itself very seriously. It invites you to imagine what the rest of the galaxy looks like. And it doesn't want to explain more than it has to in the moment. Probably the scene that does the best at communicating the sheer breadth of the universe is that first cantina scene in New Hope, where you walk in and there's these dozens of species talking in different languages. The droids get kicked out. There's the Empire. We don't know how it rose. It sets all these trappings up and invites you to imagine what this galaxy is like.
Yeah, it throws so much at you because in that cantina scene, you have all the no two aliens look quite alike. Scenes like that, or seeing the rapid transition from interior spaceship, and then alien planet, and then the domestic parts of that alien planet across 20 minutes, maybe in the opening act of Star Wars. You see these different environments that, in some ways, look quite polished and clean. If it's the Imperial uh, uh, Star
Destroyer.
Star Destroyer, thank you. I was going to call it the Battlestar Galactica, but that's a conversation for
Different
yet another
subjects.
day.
Yep,
Yeah,
yep.
the rip-offs of Star Wars. You see the size dynamic between that and the Rebel cruiser that's trying to escape it. The cleanness of that ship, the humans, the standard. Like just watching that first shot of just standard guys in helmets. Like what's going to come through these doors, and it's like you see a stormtrooper for the first time, and it's this skeletal, strange army of monstrosities, and then a Frankenstein in black armor comes up, and it's terrifying. The first time that you see it with, unless you know the context of what a Darth Vader is before going into that movie, if you see that through the eyes of a child, it's horrifying.
Mhm. Yeah, we'll talk about the construction of Darth Vader as a villain and why he's been so enduring in a future episode.
Mhm.
But most people listening to this probably already know this bit of trivia. But at the time when George Lucas released A New Hope, he paid out of his own pocket the penalty for not having opening credits to his movie because he wanted a smash cut into the Tantive 4 being pursued by Darth Vader's Star Destroyer.
Yeah,
And
3 short paragraphs worth of exposition
Mhm.
and then action.
Yeah, it was just apparently so stunning to the sheer scale of what was happening. But yeah, to go off what you said, Connor, it was also the way in which the cinematography builds into the suspension of disbelief of the transition between the different environments where you feel it's not like, oh, there's a planet down there, but obviously they're not going to shoot a planet. It's like, no, we're going everywhere. We're in the ship, we're in the other ship, we're in space.
Mhm.
We're going to show the droids in the escape pod, we're going to show the desert, we're going to show the farm, inside the sand crawler.
It's very complete.
It's almost like the modern feeling of like you're on a Minecraft map and you can stare. It's like I'm gonna go there. The Star Wars movies are like, yep, any of these places they exist and you can go there.
This doesn't feel like a Star Trek set where you know that outside the bounds of the like control room, there's just the back side of cardboard. Everything feels real. It feels lived in. It started off a whole trend of this cinematic realism that was allotted to uh, films in the genre, in science fiction, fantasy, things like that.
Yeah, Star Trek certainly took more
Yeah.
risks thematically and I would say culturally than Star Wars did. Star Wars again is harkening back to very old tropes. It's a fantasy monomyth dressed up in a sci-fi costume.
And without poking too many holes, it's not the most complex story at the beginning. It has certainly grown to be more, some would argue. But for if we're looking at the original set of films, the original 6 movies, or the original 3 before that, it's not a Citizen Kane story of narrative complexity. It's a story of good versus evil. But what does that offer an audience?
Yeah, so the story itself is again not the most complicated, and as Star Wars has tried to find an identity and survive as a multimedia franchise in an increasingly competitive world, it has, branched out into other genres containing the same setting. There are mystery stories. There are, you know, uh, there's romance. There's war. There's sort of paranormal mystery, even with some strange force things that happen. So it's using the setting to delve into different genres. But the original 3 movies, if you look at it, it's hero's journey. There's also a war story, uh, but it's not shot like a war movie. In where, no, because it depends on what your definition of a war movie is. But
It's more adventure. It's more like the. I don't think anyone in a certain generation are going to understand what serials are, but uh, way back when George Lucas was a young child, before movies, there would be 15-minute shorts that are just sections of the superhero Flash Gordon. What is Flash Gordon going to do? Oh, the Shadow. The Shadow knows. And it's just these little snippets of stories. And that's what George Lucas wanted to do. You aren't introduced to the beginning of a story. He's going to drop you in right into the middle of the entire epic of this serial. And then it's going to tie itself up at the end in a satisfying way, but it's part of something greater. I feel like that's a phrase that comes up. Everything, when you step into Star Wars, feels like this is all part of something greater because of how real it looks, how real it feels, and how real the characters are realized in the story.
Yeah, we could probably get into this more later, but it's also why, even with some of the writing and story perhaps not landing perfectly, especially in the prequel and sequel movies,
Mhm.
I would say for the most part, more so in the prequels, they still manage to have this sense of a living and breathing universe where things are still happening that are not the focus on the heroes all the time. And I think that is, again, primarily why Star Wars has been so enduring. Is one, it tells recognizable stories and with characters that go through recognizable arcs, and it speaks to this, it is very easy to suspend disbelief and believe that a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away might actually exist. And you know that it doesn't, but it's fun to imagine it does. And Star Wars is fairly good at, very rarely is someone brought back to life, or, do the stakes not feel real for the heroes?
Mhm.
Luke loses a hand, Obi-Wan
Yeah.
dies.
Mhm. And while he may return as a guide, that could be seen as, allowing the specter of this person to guide you into your own life and trying to remember their lessons. In the text of the film, it, yes, is a ghost that comes back, but he is still lost.
So I think the next thing we wanted to talk about, Connor, was the way in which Star Wars started as a movie and then
Mhm.
became a trilogy, and then from there it sort of exploded. So let's talk about the other two different canons and what we
Mhm.
think of all the multimedia and our approach to that.
See, by the time the original movie came out, there was a book, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, that was a proposed sequel to A New Hope if it didn't get enough money to make Empire Strikes Back. It was a much smaller story. From then onward, any book that was told in the Star Wars universe was considered part of what is now known as Legends. So from 1978 until whenever the Disney merger was,
2015. Yep.
there was this collection of largely books, but comic books, video games. They never got into TV as much, although the Clone Wars was made during this
But has been now
transitory
grandfathered
time.
into the
Yeah.
new canon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there are two canons for Star
Mm-hmm.
Wars. There's the Legends continuity,
Right.
which does not all hang together very well. The new canon is not perfect, and then that is everything, the 11 movies now, the Clone Wars TV show, and then everything released 2015 and after the Disney acquisition. Because there was a layered canon in the Legends continuity, because George Lucas was primarily a businessman, and someone
Mm-hmm.
approached him and said, "I would like to license Star Wars to release a thing." He's like, "You can do it," and he didn't have great centralized control.
He only had two matters he wanted people to avoid. You don't talk about the Clone Wars, and you don't talk about Luke Skywalker's mother. He had plans for that. Anything else was fair game.
They referenced the Clone Wars in ways that ended up not being true. Later books would contradict other books, and then when Lucas released Return of the Jedi, invalidated a bunch of stuff, and then the prequels came out, invalidated more,
Yeah.
and there would be statements released by George Lucas about what was true and what was not.
Mhm.
So the canon was before really this modern sense of all of it needs to be consistent. And
Mhm.
Connor will notice that I really like everything to be consistent. I like the ways in which you can build stories off of each other in a multimedia way, where they feed into each other, where they call back, where characters introduced in one media can jump across to another. I'm a big fan of that and how it speaks to the ways in which different media can tell different stories, but the world itself, it's just different windows into the same story. So
I do like some of the imaginative directions that Legends went into. There are certain stories I'll call back to, like Dark Empire or the Thrawn trilogy. The majority of this Legends canon is non-canonical. What we have is, what would you call it now? Just the new canon?
the current Star
Yeah,
Wars canon is what I would call it. And this is not to say
right.
that there was not great media produced in the Legends continuity.
It's pulled a lot in. It's pulled characters like Thrawn. It's referencing figures like Darth Revan and Darth Bane. So there are elements from Legends that are being revitalized, and I find that exciting. So,
Yeah, and I think a lot of them could be done, hopefully be done justice. I mean, technically, even mainstays like the Knights of the Old Republic, which is one of the better Star Wars stories ever told. They're technically in the Legends continuity, but some people are very upset about Legends all being declared non-canon. I viewed it as a pragmatic approach to, if you're going to start to want to have this unified multimedia empire that you just paid $1 billion to George Lucas for, this whole tiered canon system was not going to work in an era where everyone who's read everything is going to be like, but wait, in chapter 13 of this book, this character dies, but why is he showing up at issue 47 over here? And then he's left-handed and never mentions his dead mother when he appears in the movie.
And what about his mustache?
And he did not have nearly enough time between the battles of Endor and Hoth to grow that mustache. So I think they employ multiple full-time canon checkers now.
Yeah, I believe, isn't Pablo Hidalgo the head of Star Wars storytelling? I believe someone is in charge. Someone's running the ship here.
And they're still not perfect. For example, most recently, there was that comic series released about Kanan Jarrus and what happened for him during Order 66. And then 5 years later, David Filoni, one of the golden childs of the growing Star Wars canon, was like, I want to do it differently in my show, This Bad Batch. And they're like, okay, fine. We're going to make that one scene where that happens, we can say it happened differently. And then everything else, all the rest of it will be canon. So there are still small contradictions, as will happen. And I do not like those, but I accept them. But largely, you can then accept, okay, the rest of it still happened as, and it was still referenced.
And I think in old or new canon, you prioritize it by whatever the films say is paramount, and then anything in live action media that doesn't contradict that, and then anything in animated, anything in book, anything in comic book. But in the new canon, it's much more cohesive, much more supported. Whereas in Legends, it's, I'm going to tell a story about this random Jedi 5 million years ago, and it's, interesting, but not always connected well.
Yeah. So we're going to take the approach. We're primarily going to talk about things that are in the current canon, but we're going to talk about all of it as we consider it all equally valid, whether it's in a film, anywhere from A New Hope to The Rise of Skywalker, or the Rogue One to The Empire Strikes Back. Whether it's a book that was released by Timothy Zahn reintroducing Thrawn, or one of the new comics introducing Dr. Aphra, we consider all of it equally valid and all interesting parts of the Star Wars universe. We might talk about some interesting Legends thing and certain highlights or spotlights in the future about what we found interesting, and then, or there's also some really terrible stuff released in Legends, by the way.
Oh yeah, isn't there a rabbit? There's a green rabbit.
No, he's canon now. They brought him into the new canon.
That's excellent.
He's appeared in a short story, 2 comics I can think of, and one of the novels.
Interesting. So. I shouldn't judge, because I think where Alex and I are going to differ is that you're very much by the new canon book, and my head canon is still active enough where characters like Jaina Solo and Mara Jade still exist, because nothing has said that they haven't existed yet. Just because Leia and Han didn't refer to their dead or missing or long-lost daughter doesn't mean that she doesn't exist.
Well, and I'm all for imagining Legends as a different timeline, I mean, Marvel is doing a multiverse thing right now, so, imagine it in a different multiverse or a different version of reality, if you'd like.
Or they are legends. They're just stories told in the galaxy.
Yeah. And then, of course, we'll have to talk about how that impacts Star Wars visions. But this is our approach for talking about things. We're going to talk about things from the movies, things from the new books, things from the comics, pretty much 2015 and after, for all the media that are not the movies and the Clone Wars TV show.
So I'd say that this is our preamble, our ambling preamble, our Amblin sponsored preamble.
They got it, yep.
That's Steven Spielberg, for those of you who didn't know that he ran Amblin. Thank you so much for listening. We've been talking Star Wars. We'll see you sometime soon in a galaxy right here.